Welcome to the abnormal psychology on late life and neurocognitive disorders. Let the animation play through. I think you'll enjoy it. As it says, endless. So, we're going to be talking about aging issues, and then this is about how they measure it too. But in our country, the elderly are not revered. And that's important to me since I'm now in that age that your text classifies as young old as opposed to old or oldest ode. So I'm part of the baby boomer generation, and we actually were the largest generation ever. There's kind of a hard demarcation for when the baby boomer generation started, 1945-46, at the end of World War II. There was this huge explosion, as you can imagine, of babies when all the men came back from the war. We're getting ready we have driven the economy throughout our lifetime. The millennials now outnumber the baby boomers only because so many baby boomers have died off. But the millennials have almost as big an impact as we boomers did when we were growing up, especially in the economic market, because there's so many of us. Now the area that we're going to be impacting, of course, is the wellness industry. 10,000 of my cohort a day turned 65. So that's a lot of people. And most of us are not anywhere near ready to retire. So here's some myths about late life. It's not definitive that you're gonna have a cognitive decline. The last studies I saw about memory, for example, there's a 5% difference between a 70-year-old and a 20-year-old. Most older or late life people are not depressed, although it can be a lonely time for some people. Most of us do very well alone. Older people do not lose interest in sex. For you guys, that means grandma and grandpa are still getting it on. There's a list of of myths on the right also. Again, they're all myths. We will not, however, be the generation that sits in a rocking chair on the porch. That's not going to happen. That's expressed a little bit in this commercial. So there are problems with aging, and I definitely agree with Betty Davis. Old age ain't no place for sissies. It's tough getting old. our physical problems do multiply. It takes us longer to recover. We lose friends and loved ones, and we can't deny 80% of the elderly have at least one medical condition. Sleep becomes a problem, insomnia especially, and a lot of the elderly have chronic problems, heart disease, diabetes, etc. They're also on a lot of different drugs. And part of the challenge with this is the psychoactive drugs, when we're talking about it, have usually been tested on young people. And old people may not respond the same way. So who's the leading carrier of AIDS? Well, it depends on what kind of AIDS you're talking about. Hearing aids, roll aids. Got to have a sense of humor about this stuff. But seriously, the elderly are the number one carriers of HIV because my generation was not raised using condoms, and they have this feeling that, well, they're old, they're not messing around, but they are. And so HIV is a serious problem in the elderly. So another problem with the elderly is suicide. We've talked about earlier about how suicide goes along with depression, and there is a stat that says that 80% of the elderly who attempt to complete suicide are depressed. The elderly make up only 12% of the population, but they're 25% of the suicides. So what that means is that there are fewer attempts for more success. When someone that's older decides they're going to commit suicide, they do it, and they want to check out. They've had enough. So one of the things that impacts the elderly, and you'll be getting more and more of this coming your way. You'll probably be asked to vote on it at some point in time. The concept of assisted suicide, I think it's legal it's certainly legal in Oregon. I think there's 2 other states that it's now legal in. So how much of an impact does depression have on someone's ability to choose assisted suicide or to have the plug pulled if they're on life support? And, from a healthy person, a young person's point of view, anybody that wants to die must be depressed. And while someone may be depressed, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not in control of their faculties. They may just be really tired of suffering, and they want to put an end to it. And they feel like their life is not a good quality. They want to die with dignity instead of being kept alive to lay and suffer. So it's a big legal, ethical question. It is, in reality, a Ch14. Now, in the last class that I taught, people weren't sure what Ch14 was. They kind of understood it, but they didn't really. So Ch14 was brought up in a novel by Joseph Heller long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. But anyway, it was about the Korean War and the pilots flying missions. And so when they got up to where they flew 20 or 25 missions, then they could go home. But what happened is every time they hit the mark, then the Army or the Air Force raised the level of the missions from 20 to 25 to 30 and so on. And so the only way you could get out of flying the missions was if you were crazy. But if you said you were crazy and you didn't want to fly if you said you didn't want to fly any more missions, you weren't crazy. So that's Ch14. So the research designs usually are cross-sectional or longitudinal, looking at cohorts and the time of the measurement. This is important to do if you're doing any kind of research or looking at research. What kind of research was it? Is it something at one point in time, or is it something that extended over years or decades? The reality is most elderly people do not have cognitive disorders. Okay, and in fact, the prevalence of it, even though we've had this focus on Alzheimer's, dementia, and so forth, the focus of it has increased because it is debilitating and so forth, but the prevalence of it has decreased. Now, part of the challenge I feel, because one of the things in positive psychology that I'm always talking about is positive self-talk. And if you keep saying that you forget things and, oh, I must be old, everybody forgets things. So you have to watch out for the negative self-talk, because you may be creating your own self-fulfilling prophecy. So what is dementia? Well, I think that's every person that as you approach late life, everybody's greatest fear. Not that you're going to die, but that you're going to lose your ability to think and know who you are and know who other people are. So the fear of dementia is a great fear, and it develops slowly. It can be detected, but people have to be paying attention. The list on the right just shows some of the conditions that bring on dementia as part of their course. Alzheimer's was first described by Alzheimer in 1906, and it's still irreversible. Usually death is in about 12 years. Now with certain medications, it's a little bit more after it's fully onset. And starts off with difficulty remembering recent events, learning things, being irritable. As it progresses, people have trouble with language, can't find words. They're disoriented with time and place. And because of that, they get agitated, and then of course they get depressed. Now there's changes in the brain. These can be picked up on scans now. They don't have to wait for autopsy, but the brain actually starts to shrink. There you get this plaques and these neurofibril tangles that seem to kind of strangle and smother the neurons and the axons, and it really kind of I describe it as it's like kudzu in the brain. If you think of kudzu on the side of the road growing over things, it just kind of engulfs a tree and kind of strangles it to death, smothers it almost. And it doesn't look bad in the middle of summer because you've got all the green on it. But when winter comes, you see that it's actually killing the tree underneath it because it's not letting it get any light. So there's about an 80% chance that it's inherited. Some people say it tends to skip a generation. I'm not sure of the accuracy of that because I've seen it in generation that's not skipped. there's a chromosome that if you have the APOE4 allele gene on chromosome 19, your risk factor is increased by 20%. And some of the environmental factors, smoking, being single, depression, these are correlated to a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. Again, it's correlation, not causation. If you eat more of the Mediterranean diet, which is kind of on the right, a lot of pasta, fruits, nuts, oils, fish, red meats, the least, sweets right up there next to red meats, then that seems to lower the risk for Alzheimer's, as does exercise and continually using the brain. Okay, crossword puzzles, reading the newspaper, working on the computer, anything that's going to keep you active and thinking instead of just sitting there, say, watching TV all day. So there's different types of dementia. If you look at the scans on the right, the frontal lobe, frontotemporal dementia is what is found in Pick's disease, and as opposed to Alzheimer's, has more in the back part of the brain. There's vascular dementia, which is usually brought on by a stroke, where you have a cardiovascular event. There's either a rupture of a blood vessel or a blockage of like with a clot, and then a certain amount of the brain is deprived of blood, and then the cells die, and then depending again on the extent of it and where in the brain it occurs, dementia can be brought on to very significant degrees, and it varies widely depending on where the stroke impacts. Now, dementia with Lewy bodies, which are things that show up in the brain, there's two types with Parkinson's and without Parkinson's disease. And these are the people you see that have kind of that shuffling gait and a loss of memory. That can can easily be mistaken for Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And they can have cognitive symptoms can come and go, as can the visual hallucinations and intense dreams. And then there's other kinds of dementias caused by disease and injury. You can have encephalitis or meningitis, HIV, and then, of course, head trauma, traumatic brain injury, tumors, and then nutritional deficits. B complex, a lack of B complex vitamins can cause, ongoing dementia. So what works to prevent and treat? Well, the prevention we've talked about a little bit is, keeping your brain active is one thing. There's no real drugs that reverse it. Some newer drugs tend to slow it down a little bit. So this is Alzheimer's specifically we're talking about there. And yeah, you can take antidepressants for the depression, antipsychotics for the agitation, but they don't do anything for the dementia itself. Psychological treatments, one of the things that's becoming popular and seems to have some good effect is using what's referred to as the Montessori method. Now, you've probably heard of Montessori schools. It's where and part of the Montessori method of teaching is letting children work at their own pace. And so they've taken that method into working with the basics with Alzheimer's and other dementia patients, and it seems to have a good impact. It doesn't do anything to reverse the disease. It just helps people get along better. There needs to be huge support and psychotherapy for the family of the patient, because being a caregiver to someone with Alzheimer's or some of the other dementia challenges is just will suck the life out of people. I mean, it's a totally thankless job that there's no let up from. You can have cognitive interventions, things early on when the disease is in the early stages. But again, that helps. It doesn't stop it. Now, delirium is different than dementia. Okay, and delirium is best thought of as a clouded state of consciousness. People can't focus. They have fragmented thinking. They're disoriented. They have memory problems. Their mood swings. Usually comes on rapidly and can fluctuate during the day. People are delirious at times with schizophrenia. So this is, this is not just limited to late life cognitive disorders. And detection of it is, especially in older adults, is often missed because they don't complain about it. So here's just a checklist of the difference between dementia and delirium. Dementia starts slow and it's gradual. Delirium is a rapid onset, and so on. Delirium usually caused by medical conditions, can be drugs, nutrition, dehydration. People become, if they're dehydrated enough, they get delirious. Of course, infections and fever, surgery, all of those things can lead to delirium, which in most cases, if you remove the cause, which is the list up there, the delirium will abate, go away. Obviously, you need to know what the underlying medical condition or problem is. Okay. Next, we're going to go to legal and ethical issues, some of which we just started to address in here. So until then, if you have any questions or problems, don't hesitate to email me.